This section refers to the supply curve. So in the previous movie that you would have looked at, you would have seen that we talked about the demand. Now we're going to talk about what happens with supply. And you can see already that there's a difference. You remember that when we talked about a demand curve, the demand curve was downward sloping, that is, it had an inverse relationship. Supply relates to the production process, which means that suppliers operate in a completely different fashion. You remember that when you talked about demand and consumers, we had the term that we knew as consumer sovereignty, and consumer sovereignty simply said the consumer was king, and a consumer decided what they wouldn't and wouldn't buy at particular price points. So to support that, on the other side, obviously a producer needs to make the same sorts of considerations. And by making those sorts of considerations, their motive is different. A producer, in fact, is interested in producing more to the market if he's able to achieve a higher price. So if we use this graph and we look at price points again at $1, $2 and $3, and we can see that on this occasion, as you move up that curve, we have a situation where at $1, a producer is only prepared to supply 50. At $2, a producer might be prepared to supply 100. And at $3, you can see that a producer decides that this is pretty good. He's going to supply $150. The reason that this upward sloping occurs is that the law of supply says that a producer will supply to the market at a price point at which he gains maximum return. That was different to the law of demand, which said that at a particular price point, a consumer would buy based on price only. So the lower the price, the more. So the principles are much the same, only we've actually reversed them, hence the change in the slopes of these graphs. The same deal applies with these, that we have, in this case, movements, and you'll remember that from the demand explanation that we had. And you remember also that we said that these movements were, in this case, this would be an expansion, and in this case, this would be a contraction. And the same for this graph. We know that when we're talking about movements, that this relates to price factors only. And I wonder if you can remember what the term was that we used for that. I'm sure if you think carefully, you'll remember that it was ceteris paribus conditions. As is the same for demand, so supply also has a situation whereby it is not just price factors, we also have non-price factors. And they're not dissimilar to the non-price factors that affected what happened in demand. In this case, what occurs in our original graph, it should have been in the original curve at S1, we can have a shift to the right to S2, or we can have a shift to the left to S3. And you remember that these shifts were called, in this case, this was a decrease, and in this case we had an increase. In other words, we've been able to improve the supply position by increasing it, or conversely, something has gone wrong in the market, so we could have some fairly difficult situations in terms of the way the economy is functioning, and this may in fact lead to a decrease in supply. For each of those, again, if we take a point that we draw through all three curves, we can see that the increase and decrease is quite obvious, that if you move from S1 back to S3, you can see how the decrease affects in terms of quantity. And on the other side of it, if there was an increase for some reason, then you would see the increase occur in this direction out to supply curve 2. The non-price factors, if you remember, are things like the availability of imports, consumer sentiment, investor sentiment, and there were a number of others that you should have gone through, and those are the conditions that we apply to this particular area. So the questions you would need to ask yourself at this point is, in this particular movie, we've talked a little bit about both the demand and supply curves, but we've concentrated here quite obviously on the supply. But when you think about both these curves, it's extremely important that you understand that the conditions that are operating in the market operate in the same fashion for both a producer and a consumer. And that's the importance of these. We've shown in this last movie the issue of supply, and we can see that it has a direct relationship in terms of price and quantity, because a producer is willing to supply to the market more when he gets a greater return, whereas a consumer is not prepared to buy at that price. They wish to maximise their purchases, and so it's slightly different. And in a third movie, we'll actually put these graphs together and we'll show you how that works.